I'm interested in how the idea of the state changed over the course of the 20th century and what people did with these changing ideas. There are kind of two ways of thinking about the state at the beginning of the 20th century. One is in terms of the idea of the social contract, that the state is a legitimate organization holding power. And the other organization is that actually the state, regardless whether it is legitimate or not, is the de facto power that wields what Max Weber called the monopoly over the use of force over a given territory. Essentially, there emerges a kind of split between these two conceptions, which eventually culminates in the Cold War kind of idea of, the free world and the totalitarian world, and the sort of division that, in the free world, the state ultimately is a product of a kind of contract, and that is particularly represented by ideas of the political philosopher John Rawls, a kind of revival of the old early modern social contract idea. And then on the other hand is the illegitimate but very forceful kind of Bolshevik, if you like, but also Nazi idea of the state as the organization that just holds power. It's particularly interesting to see how these two ideas come into play in specific situations or speeches or interventions. And one of the most famous ones is the German sociologist and political thinker, or eventually he became a political thinker, Max Weber, in Munich in 1919, at the time when Munich itself became briefly a Soviet republic. So rather like eventually the Soviet Union, which only emerges in 1922, but Munich was already a Soviet republic in 1919. And it's at this time that Weber gives his definition of the state as the holder of the monopoly over the use of force. What does he mean when he says that the state has a monopoly on violence? First of all, there's a translation issue. I mean, in English, there's just the term violence, and in German, there are two words, Gewalt and Gewaltsamkeit. It's a bit like lenience and leniency, so the equivalent would be maybe violency. So it's this idea that it's not necessarily that the state is always violent, it just has a kind of tendency to be violent. It means that, for example, a state will, when it's necessary, claim the property of its subjects for its own purposes. So, I don't know, if a state wants to build a new railway, then your house will have to go. And that's the monopoly on violence. I mean, ultimately, this definition for him was actually a kind of cynical recognition of, what the idea of the state, which once seemed so glorious in a sense, has come to be reduced to. He was, at the end of the 19th century, he believed in the sort of great empire nations, the possibility of this new powerful states that would dominate kind of the world and so on. And then with Germany's defeat, but also even before Germany's defeat, with the sort of negotiation of peace with the Bolsheviks, he was quite influenced by Trotsky and Bolshevik thought and this whole rather derogatory kind of attitude to these institutions and ideas of liberal statehood. Some states are fleeting, some are more permanent. I mean, for example, probably empires, some empires at least, are more long-lasting because they have a very kind of complex internal configuration. They're not really states. They are kind of bodies which house within them various communities that can also include states. But specific nation states or units like this don't necessarily have a particularly long-lasting existence. So they can, some states exist for, 20 years, other states exist maybe for 300 years. I mean, there's no probably average lifetime of a state. Probably, I mean, if history teaches anything, is that, a state can proclaim that it will exist for 1,000 years and then only last 12 years, like the Third Reich. Or the opposite, people may believe that, the state will exist for many, many decades, or, even centuries, like, I don't know, the Roman Empire or the Holy Roman Empire. And then eventually the day comes when it disappears. They wake up in a different situation. I'm very interested in these transitions when states disappear and legal systems disappear, or when previously long-lasting institutions fade away. the question is, what do people do with this kind of uncertainty? So how do people behave in a situation of uncertainty? So I'm thinking of encouraging people to kind of get interested in the mentality of people who seek alternative forms of allegiance in the absence of a state, of a viable state. I want to encourage people who are reading history to think in a more multi-directional way, in a sense, about history. So often people read history in order to extract some kind of logic and then impose this logic on their present situation or the future. But there's another way of thinking about it, and that's just to understand how different groups react to crises.